Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and I think I got the right bench, the one that Christopher Hitchens sat on when he made that marvellous documentary The Morning After in 1998. It was the first anniversary of Princess Diana's death, so I've been trying to figure it out by looking at the footage, because I want to make a video now about Christopher Hitchens, because there are 6 benches on this side of the path, 3 to my left, a further 3 to my right, but I have to look back at the angles a little bit. And so here I am outside Kensington Palace in London. It was Princess Diana's residence until her death on, if I got it right, the 1st of September 1997. Of course, her car crash was, I think, shortly before midnight on the 31st of August, although she survived for a few hours in that Paris hospital. But I want to talk about Christopher Hitchens because he is such an utterly intriguing character. I so sorely regret that I never met him, but to read him was to know him, and he made an enormous impression on me. So he's been a splendid inspiration for me and so many others. Christopher Hitchens, Christopher Eric Hitchens, as he liked to sometimes style himself, he was born at Portsmouth in 1949, the son of a Royal Naval officer and a housewife, as we weren't ashamed to call housewives at the time. So he was their firstborn, and then he had his brother Peter, who was born, 3 or 4 years later, who was born in Malta, because there were still British bases on Malta until 1979. It was still a crown colony at the time of Hitchens' infancy. So then they moved back to the United Kingdom. They lived in North Britain, latterly in South Britain, and eventually his father left the Royal Navy, became a bursar for a prep school in Oxford. So they lived there. It was to his lasting regret his father turned down an offer to have some sort of position at a private members club in London because he was able to reside there. So family finances were stretched, and he was able to go to the Lees School in Cambridge. So it was a Methodist school because the Methodist Conference decided they better set up a public school, private school that is, public, i.e. if you can afford to pay the fees, in either Oxford or Cambridge. They opted for Cambridge in the end, so it's beside the River Cam on this rather flat land, which would have been a flood meadow not so long ago, because that's what Lee means in Anglo-Saxon, like field. So he went there, though it was fairly well regarded, but certainly not amongst sort of the top 10 or the Clarendon 9 of British schools. He prospered academically, although he wasn't that keen on classics or foreign languages, but fascinated by politics, always a leftist, following world affairs, wondering why French paratroopers were preparing to fly from Algiers to take over Paris as almost a military coup in the early 60s when Charles de Gaulle prepared to grant independence to Algeria. So his father, was hacked off, felt he'd been very let down by the Royal Navy, the establishment generally. As Hitchens said, his father was a conservative with nothing to be conservative about. But Hitchens himself became a socialist, joined the Labour Party, later joined a faction called the International Socialists. As he said, he shunned the imperialisms of Washington and Moscow to favour, independence for those who wanted it, but international cooperation. Although, perhaps quixotically, he was soon a votary of the cause of European integration. So although he was a leftist, he always excoriated Soviet communism for the dictatorships of Eastern Europe. He had nothing but the deepest disdain. So he was in some ways a classical liberal. Was it Conor Cruise O'Brien he cited to say, no, it's the liberal values that really motivate me. And Hitchens, perhaps curiously for a socialist, was unmoved by economics, but he honestly believed into the 80s that global capitalism was about to collapse. So he was in the Labour Party, but never really a conventional Labour person, and thought there was a lot wrong with Labour. So he went up to Balliol College, Oxford in 1967, so that's one of the most ancient colleges in Oxford, arguably the oldest, named after that Balliol family that founded it, that produced John Balliol, who was briefly King of Scots, Tomb Tabard. Anyway, Balliol, it had been known in the late 19th century as being the nursery of imperial administrators. But the days when one could be a district commissioner were not long over when he went up. It had strong Commonwealth links. There's that famous quip about seeing some newsreel in the 1950s of various natives, as people weren't embarrassed to say in those days, of some dusky hue, and I don't know which colony, rowing down their jungly river, and some wag shouting, "Well rowed Balliol," because there were some non-white undergraduates in Balliol, with very few in any other college at the time. That now be regarded as a racialist remark the person had made. So he was reading PPE, that's Philosophy, Politics and Economics. So it was designed just after the First World War, when they decided that literae humaniores was no longer a sufficient training for a would-be statesman. Anyway, he didn't spend very much time on his studies, was protesting all the time, arrested, trying to disrupt a cricket match when South Africans were playing because he was trying to bring back the apartheid system, protesting the door of a barber who wouldn't cut the hair of non-whites. So when he was arrested at that cricket match, someone came to testify for him in his trial that he hadn't been violent. Turned out to be the president of the local Liberal Association. But when this Liberal found out that Hitchens was Trotskyite, he said, "Well, had I known you're that sort of person, I would not have spoken up in your favour." But anyway, Hitchens, he was found not guilty. So in the summer of 1968, then he took a kite to Cuba to volunteer to work gathering the harvest. But he wanted to see if Cuba was this genuine socialist idyll he'd been led to believe it was, a proletarian paradise. Was it really this heaven on earth for workers, or was it just another degenerated workers' state, as Trotsky had said at the Soviet Union? Because, of course, Fidel Castro was really, a poodle of Brezhnev at the time. I'm not sure quite if he reached the conclusion that really it was little better than the Soviet Union at the time, but he left, and they came back in August 1968, which is the time of the Prague Spring was crushed by Soviet tanks. So earlier, according to his brother Peter, he'd said, "I couldn't care if the Red Army watered their horses at Hendon, which is a London suburb." So anyway, he graduated in 1970. He got a third-class degree, something he chose not to advertise when he started to make a bit of a name for himself as a public intellectual. And he never took any further qualifications, despite the fact of him being awarded a professorship by some university or other in the United States in later decades. And he got a job as a BBC, training to be a producer. You could live on that kind of salary. Accommodation was very cheap in those days, still somewhat involved in the Labour Party. He had Greek friends. He went over to Greece as well. There was a military junta back then, which he thought was utterly loathsome, and he tried to disguise the numbers of his Greek contacts by writing their phone numbers backwards in his address book. We actually had address books in those days. And he was aghast that some Labourites even thought that junta might be a good thing because it was anti-Marxist. Anyway, his parents had split up, and he later discovered that they'd really had a dead marriage for years, but they stayed together for the sake of the children, as one had to in those days. And his mother took up with a disgraced ex-Anglican clergyman, and they later went to Greece. And then sometime later, he was informed by his then girlfriend that a woman had been found dead, a British woman was found dead in Athens in mysterious circumstances. As it happened, that woman happened to have the surname Hitchens. And his girlfriend says to him, "But that's a rather unusual name. Do you think that could be your mother?" Well, it was, and he was called to try and identify the corpse. He flew out there, and indeed he did. And he discovered that his mother tried to phone him 6 times in that hotel room. If she'd got through, would she have not have topped herself? She wrote him a suicide note, which he chose not to disclose the contents of. So she and her paramour, they formed a suicide pact, and he said there was some sort of evidence at the last moment she chose not to. She tried not to kill herself, but it was too late. I wonder if it was pills or something. And it was within sight of the Acropolis, sorry. So his brother, he felt, was too youthful to go out and perform this mournful duty. Anyway, so Hitchens came back to London, and he worked in various publications like the New Statesman. He visited Iraq, and he had some warm words to say for the Ba'athist dictatorship at the time. So by the early 80s, he said he was fed up to his back teeth of London, and he was fascinated by the United States. So he flew out there in 1982. I think it was very shortly before the Falklands conflict erupted. And so a lot of leftists in the UK said that the United Kingdom should not fight. What was the point of trying to save a few rocks and a flock of penguins? Just let the Argentines have it. Some leftists in the United Kingdom were a bit like Orwell said, that thought it was standing to attention for God Save the King was worse than stealing from the poor box. The intellectuals were actively anti-patriotic. But no, he thought this was a war worth fighting. There was justice and right on Britain's side, Moreover, it would bring down the military dictatorship in Argentina, and indeed he turned out to be right. His father was about the only Tory who was again. So he was always an anti-monarchist, Hitchens, and so I disagreed with him on a lot, but he was always a fascinating voice. He developed an early and deep contempt for faith and refused to bow his head and pretend to be religious when he was at school. He dabbled in homosexualism as a schoolboy and undergraduate, but rapidly grew out of it. Became avowedly hetero, but is never homophobic. He vouchsafed that he had 2 encounters with men at Oxford who later served in Thatcher's cabinet, though he never named names. I suppose a gentleman never tells upon a gentleman. Anyway, so what else? So he moved to Washington, D.C. to write for various publications. He was there for decades. He only became an American citizen in something like 2006. So he detested theocracy, and he realized there was more of this in Dar al-Islam than there was in Christendom, a term which has largely fallen into disuse. So he was a man of letters, and he was someone who was fascinated by history. He penned a history of Cyprus. His first wife was Greek, which gave him a deep interest in the Hellenistic world. So he had 3 children, but I wonder if one of them was his second wife, Carol Blue, who was Jewish. He subsequently discovered that he was actually, is it a quarter or was it 1/8 Jewish himself? Because only after his mother died, his grandmother revealed that they were actually Jewish, or at least partly Jewish on her side. And of course, being matrilineal, that's the side that matters. But long before that, he believed that anti-Semitism was always the most vile prejudice, although he confessed to having a slight distaste for people from Yorkshire. Can't think why. Well, what else about Hitchens? So I'm about to sneeze. He obviously was a socialist and thought that the Republicans were usually worse than the Democrats. He railed against Reagan. He'd met Thatcher. He revealed that she publicly smacked his bottom in front of many other journalists. It's hard to believe it happened. He was a friend of A. McCann. He believed that Northern Ireland should be expelled from the United Kingdom and fused with the Republic of Ireland, though of course he loathed the semi-theocracy we had in the Republic of Ireland until quite recently. And he wrote a book against Britain's favourite fetish, which was monarchy. So he long ago smelt a rat about Princess Diana, who was adulated for just showing up and lapping up all the attention and adulation, who accepted this exaltation as no more than her due, who did nothing permanently, who got this divorce settlement of £33 million in 1996, that's worth £75 million in current values, and of that, this friend of the poor gave how much to the poor? Absolute diddly squat. So, he saw through her right away, saying she wasn't all bad, and yes, she showed some compassion to one of his friends who was dying of AIDS and all that kind of thing, and that was before it was fashionable, really. But she was nothing to write home about. She was a bit of an airhead, although perhaps more media savvy than some people realise. So her life was not the greatest tragedy in the world. We're led to believe that here she was, this sacrificial virgin who married into the most unloving family in the world, almost foredoomed to meet her end in that car crash in that Parisian tunnel in the city of love. How richly ironic and bitter it was. I thought that she shouldn't be canonized in this way. And it was ridiculous to try and do things for her, to wail for someone you never knew. There was this false intimacy about this Diana cult, which has dissipated over time. And you see some of the same phenomenon with Meghan Markle. Although she's a much more polarizing figure, Diana was perhaps vapid enough not to not to voice political opinions. But largely, as the liberal left people were a bit more attracted to her, and traditionalists favoured Prince Charles, and they're split a little bit more. So then Christopher Hitchens, well, when 9/11 happened, he said it really illuminated reality for him like a mighty flash. It crystallized the situation. He felt it was really a civilization versus barbarism. And so that's why, unusually for a leftist, he was a vociferous advocate of the liberation of Afghanistan, later on Iraq. He'd long since loathed Saddam Hussein, and he initially thought that the liberation of Kuwait was a bad thing in 1991, but then he thought, well, actually, if it leads to the liberation of Iraq, then I'm going to have to support it. Although he did find that really turned his stomach. He didn't like me on the same side as George H.W. Bush, but he wanted the Kurds to be free from the threat of genocide, which always hung over them as long as the Baathists ruled Babylonia. So he split with many of his friends on the left. Then he published God is Great in 2008, perhaps his most celebrated work. This magnum opus is something I've read from cover to cover several times. It's really a fascinating evisceration of religion in general, but particularly the Abrahamic religions, and it scrutinizes the Noahide commandments, and he enjoins us not to take our morals in tabloid form. So it's highly readable, it's got pace, it's never pedestrian. So I commend it to you most warmly. You might undergo a Damascene conversion, but in the opposite direction, if you read this fabulous tome. So he drank like a fish, and he smoked like a chimney, and he contracted throat cancer, was diagnosed in 2008, and the chance of beating that, of living more than 5 years, was I think 5%. No one beats these odds, as he says. But he then gave the world's feeblest ever anti-smoking warning, saying nobody beats these odds. So he died in December 2011. It was the 18th of December, if memory serves. I remember where I was when I found out that he had died. As his dear friend Salman Rushdie said, a great voice has fallen silent. Hitchens had spoken up for Rushdie, saying, the satanic verses absolutely must be published, and we're not going to bend the knee to Wahhabist bullying. So he was a stalwart advocate of the right to offend, of freedom of expression. He was an admirer of Tony Blair, though he did have some reservations, distaste for Blair's illiberal instincts. So that was him, and his brother Peter Hitchens is well known as really the voice of the British reaction, although his brother seems to have a soft spot for political absolutism, having been a Trotskyite not so long ago. So that's Christopher Hitchens. He donated his body to medical science, and I wish there was something to visit of him to do with him. But I know he sat on one of these benches. I've seen that, and I've seen him been to the door of Private Eye and various other locations in London, just in front of Westminster Abbey, just in front of Buckingham Palace. How I wish I could have met him, but to read him is to meet him to some extent. So he deserves a statue. He's someone I was intrigued with for a while, and I watched everything on YouTube I could about him. I've read just about everything that he's written I could put my hands on, so I can't really get enough Hitchens. So if you don't know Hitchens very well, I urge you to familiarize yourself with your writings. It'll enlighten you very greatly. Well, that is my penny's worth about Peter Hitchens, who had the bad taste and the common sense to actually skewer Princess Diana, when many had decided to suspend their critical faculties on this issue. Right, toodaloo.